there's lots of stuff that I'm responsible for and I need to take responsibility for. And I think of my own experience. I've had the counselling. I've done the hard yards and the hard work. I've shed the tears. I've talked about it. I take care of myself. And yet, in these specific institutional environments, I'm still having these really adverse reactions. Is there actually something toxic about these larger environments that's contributing to how I'm feeling? Because I'm having very specific negative reactions in a lot of these places. So I'm trying to flesh that out.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking, yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to the Better Thinking podcast. Today's episode, I speak with Dr. Benjamin Habib, who I reached out to talk about his lived experience with having a panic attack on national TV. I think what Dr. Habib has done exceptionally well is the way he's addressed and managed and coped with his anxiety. And he talks about his story from being young into his professional career, about how he's gone about approaching that. And I think you'll find a nice gem towards the end of this episode with regards to how Ben's looking at his progression from working individually to wanting to connect with others as part of his journey. I think he explains it really well. So make sure you listen through all the way to the end. Also, don't forget to subscribe, share, give it a thumbs up. Tell everyone if you're getting a lot of value out of these. Tell them to go out and listen to it. It means the world to me to go out and share this with as many people as you can. So enjoy the episode. Welcome to Better Thinking Podcast. You're with Nesh Nikolic, and today's guest is Dr. Benjamin Habib. And I've invited him to the show because a little while ago, I came across his, video of a television moment that he was experiencing a panic attack. And I just thought it was such a great idea to invite him to the show to talk about his lived experience in the way, more so about how he's approached his experience post this interview, but also to find out about the lead up to this, because so many of our listeners understand anxiety somewhat, some through lived experience, some through working with people with anxiety, others with family members who've experienced that themselves. So welcome to the show, Ben. I really appreciate you coming along.
Yeah, thanks, Nesh. Thanks for the invitation.
Maybe we can kind of start, obviously we kind of touch base and connected over that first video, and I will make sure that we've shared it with our audience so they can appreciate the level of discomfort or what this brings about. But maybe you can tell us about how this all came about, for you, maybe starting at the interview, but then we can kind of go backwards or forwards depending on, what's going to fit best.
Well, let's start with the interview and then we can explore the timeline either way. So I got invited to speak on ABC News Breakfast back in February 2016, just to speak on my normal area of research expertise on North Korean security. I was going to go on there and say things that I'd said many times in the public domain. So there wasn't anything complicated about what I was going to say. I speak in public very often as a lecturer. But what I found was that the TV studio environment was radically different and much more stressful than any of the other environments that I've typically spoken in. And I didn't realize that until I was immersed in there. But by that time, I was so overwhelmed, not just by the stimuli, but the rising anxiety that I'd been experiencing in the 12 hours leading up to it. So the interview was on a Monday morning. ABC producer contacted me about 4 o'clock on the Sunday evening prior, said, yeah, I'll come on. And immediately, as soon as that happened, I'm like, starting to get nervous. which is normal. I get nervous before any kind of public speaking engagement, no matter how often I've done it.
It seems like you weren't particularly hesitant. It was something that you'd been asked to do on prior occasions in different contexts. This was another moment to go out and obviously share your expertise. And so you took the call and said, yeah, sure, I'll come in the morning.
Yeah, and I'd done another live TV interview down at the South Bank studios the year before. That was a little different because it was a live cross. The program host was in Sydney. So I was just in a little dark room staring down the barrel of a camera with no one around me at 9 o'clock at night. And even though I had the same feelings of anxiety coming in, I got through that. The interview was great, no problem. So taking this request, thought, yeah, I've done this before. I can do this. But as the Sunday night dragged on, I was just so wired. I remember watching an NBA basketball game just to chill out and relax. I can't remember who played or what happened. I was not in the moment. I didn't sleep a wink. I was just going over in my head what I was going to say on the program.
Is that what you were stuck on in terms of what am I going to say? What are the words? What were you kind of, what was keeping you up or bothering you?
Well, in the afternoon, what am I going to wear? I don't usually suit up. So I was thinking, okay, what am I going to wear? Went and got something to wear. Then it's, what am I going to say? And how am I going to order what I'm going to say? Like, I know topically what I want to say, but how am I going to deliver? I live about 25 kilometres out of the CBD, and to get to the South Bank studios in Melbourne of ABC at 6 in the morning, there was logistical considerations because I don't usually do that. I don't have to commute into the city for work, so it's not a commute that I do very often. Ended up getting there a bit early, so I'm cruising around South Bank at 6:30 in the morning just with nothing to do. And again, I'm still thinking about what I'm going to deliver. Go into the studio, they let me in. Then I go in the back, they take me to the makeup room where I had my face made up. Lovely makeup ladies in there, they were really nice to chat to. And then they just sent me in the back to sit there for about half an hour until my slot came up. I think my session got delayed by about 10 minutes as well because they did a live cross to a politician somewhere. And so I'm just sitting there ruminating, waiting for my go. And then they lead me in to the studio proper and sit me on the desk next to Virginia Trioli and Michael Rowland. And I noticed it feels like you're in the mission control of the space shuttle in Houston. There's monitors everywhere. You don't see any of this on TV because you can just see what's on the camera shot. There's so much going on in the studio. It's a very confined space. There's computer screens in the desk that you're looking at that you can't see from the TV angle. So I've had no sleep. I'm absolutely wired from anxiety. I'm sitting in this really high stimulation environment, feeling a bit claustrophobic. And I can just feel my physical reaction to this. Like I remember writing in the article, it feels like I was buzzing with electricity, like I was hooked up to some kind of electrical machine.
You wrote even about your skin feeling different. You've almost touched on a few things, just sort of listening around about unfamiliarity. There was so much uncertainty from I don't usually wear a suit. What am I going to wear? To how am I going to get into the city? What train, what bus, what place do I stop off at? Where's the actual location? How do I get there? As a matter of fact, it sounds like you got there quite early because the anxiety of don't want to be late, need to make sure I'm there on time. Then the huge unfamiliar place of, whether it be the makeup sort of space or, the waiting 30 minutes, potentially 40 with the live cross, and then coming into this room with what it sounds like, monitors and lights and people, cameras and displays, that seems quite daunting and you talk about as being quite confined. So quite a lead up to this moment.
Yeah. So by the time, they do the lead into the story, and then they ask me the first question, and Michael and Virginia are looking at me, and I'm almost having an out-of-body experience. Like I'm there, but I'm not there. I'm too mired in my physical reaction, and I'm essentially frozen. Can
you talk us through that a little bit in terms of what you can remember about the physical part, what kind of drew you in, what you were feeling, what it was like?
Really tense, sweating. I'm doing this with my fingers, which is a nervous thing that I do from time to time. I remember one of the viewers who contacted me said they noticed that and they do it too. And that they knew before the interview started, they could see what was going to happen because they could, recognize that physical tell.
I noticed you stopped breathing.
Yeah.
You're holding your breath, just that tightness that you're talking about. It came from what I saw. It was like this holding of breath, tightening up.
Yeah, so when you feel your upper body tightening up, of course, your lungs can't expand and you don't breathe properly. And then I can just feel my mind is just fogging out. And all of those things that I know really well and wanted to communicate, I couldn't access them. I wasn't there. And then you can see, like when I'm speaking, I just can't grab it. I can't get the information. I can't communicate properly. To the interviewer's credit, they could see I was struggling. They tried changing tack with a different angle on the questions. They did that 2 or 3 times, which I actually found really unhelpful because it made me have to reframe where I was at and set me back in the process. But it didn't matter really what they would have done at that point. The inertia of all the anxiety that built up to that meant that in the moment it was not going to happen. And in the end, I just said, look, I can't do this. They cut away to another story straight away, and that was that.
You mentioned that in your article that Virginia put her hand on you immediately after that and kind of just said it's okay, that she kind of got it, she understood. Yeah. And I could tell in her eyes, she looked me directly in the eyes, sort of touched me on the arm and said, look, it's okay, with great empathy. And then I got a job to do. So then they got to keep on rolling. I got escorted out and just left to my own devices. So I'm walking around like a zombie in a daze thinking, are those feelings still there?
Oh, yeah. I can't watch it again. It just makes me too uncomfortable. And I did it again.
When was the last time you watched it?
Probably, I've only watched it again once. So at the end of that week, The Project on Channel 10 did a story on it, where they showed snippets of the original interview footage, backed by a voiceover from my blog talking about how I was feeling in the moment. So it was very tastefully done. But when the producer contacted me about that the day before, they go, oh, you want to come on the show and talk about this? And my response was, are you fucking serious?
We want to do this again, do we?
So, and then I think they go, all right, okay, do you mind if we do it this way? I said, yeah, sure. Like, it's all good. Because by that time I'd written the article and the response that it was getting, it was already, I could see this was exploding everywhere. So, yeah, this is a story that I'm happy for you to tell because it's already out there and I've talked about it. But it has come up in Twitter feeds. People are saying, well, don't show the story again because that's traumatic to Ben, to have to relive it. And it's traumatic for other people that might get triggered by it. My response to that personally, like it happened in the public domain, it's always going to be in the public domain. So, I'm not going to watch it again, but it's there.
Sure. Why do you think it had such big uptake? What about that drew people to it?
I think most people don't have the language to describe what it feels like physically to experience anxiety. And often the way that it's thought of is, it's just a thing in your head. and it's not well understood that this is a full spectrum emotional, physical, psychological experience. It's the lens through which you experience reality. It's not just a thing on the side that happens. And someone who, there's nothing unique about my experience. This kind of thing happens to people all the time. What was unique about me is that it happened so publicly, and that I'm a reasonable writer, and I have a platform to be able to put that out there into the world. So that was that's what was able to take hold, that I was able to give a voice to something that many people feel, and found useful to be able to use to communicate where they were at with the people around them.
Can I ask, there's in some sense a traditional set of experiences that are common when we kind of talk about, panic. And obviously there are other, there's a plethora of other ones, for example, the sensations on your skin that you felt and so on. But did you feel a pressure on your chest at all? Like a kind of like a weight bearing on your chest, or pain on your chest?
I definitely felt pressure. I felt, that butterfly feeling.
Yeah, like churning in your stomach. Yeah. Dry
really
mouth
hardcore churn. Yep.
It looked like from the start your mouth was yeah. Did your vision change? Did it become a bit more blurry or more sharp in terms of things being more defined, brighter, darker?
I don't know if my vision changed, but because I was so detached from my physical being in that moment, I don't know if foggy is the right word, but I was definitely experiencing my environment in a different way, because I was not in place. I was not in my body in that moment.
Now, there's often kind of like a smothering feeling, or can't catch my breath. Is that where I can't do this anymore, I've got to escape, I've got to get out of here? That's what it appeared like towards the end of that. Is that what kind of showed up for you?
Well, I just realised it wasn't happening, and I wasn't going to get anywhere. And I think if you're feeling that uncomfortable in any situation, you're under no obligation to anyone to keep subjecting yourself to that. So I thought, I called it. I'm not going to try and grind through this. I'm not going to get anywhere. But there was a great shame walking out after that and thinking, I didn't perform. This is my job to come and do this. And I felt like I didn't perform like I was meant to do as an academic professional. So I was feeling really ashamed at that moment, feeling like I'd let myself down, hadn't represented myself well, and was worried about, getting trolled for that as well, and what that would mean to fail in public.
Is that the way you saw it at the time, failure?
Yeah, very much so. So all of that stuff's swirling around in your head. I'm still feeling, really disembodied. It's peak hour in the morning in Melbourne, so that area is now filled with thousands of people, and I'm getting back on the train at Flinders Street to go home.
Oh God!
And I just want to crawl up in a hole and hide away. Got home, had a good cry. But when I was going back on the train, that's when I made the choice that, okay, I'm going to write about this.
So the decision was made on the train. Wow, tell me about that.
Well, I'm just sitting there, trying to hide away. And I didn't intellectually think it through. I just thought, what can I do here to cope and get this out and just reattach to my feelings? I thought, writing, that's the thing I'm good at. I'll put this on my blog and just talk about it. I didn't do it to help people. I didn't do it to be a public voice of advocacy. I just did it to feel better in the moment. I didn't actually write it for another day. I sat on it and put down some notes like the next day when I was feeling a little bit more back in my body. And then the Tuesday night, I put together the blog, posted it on my blog that night, and then I shared it on Twitter, and I tagged in News Breakfast, and doing that is how it went viral.
Okay.
So had I not shared it on Twitter and tagged in ABC, no one would know about this.
And do you remember why you did that?
I just wanted to put that feeling out there, maybe to counter the trolling as well, and just not hide from it. Say, okay, this is my experience. I'm going to try and own this for better or worse.
So in terms of, in some sense, to counter or to, as part of your rebuttal, to have some sort of voice to some of the things that were being said.
Or my perception of what might be said. So,
you hadn't looked at that time?
No, God, no. I didn't go back on social media for a few days for precisely this reason. And this is where it's in this period where, okay, I've talked about this experience, but actually this is telling me that this is so connected to my broader history of anxiety and depression. And that fear of public humiliation, that has deep roots. And my reaction now in this moment, is connected to, stuff that has a longer lineage back in my life. And so this period just after the interview, when I've just posted the blog, this is the time when I'm also thinking, all right, maybe I've got more to say. And that's probably the genesis of the additional writings that I've done on it since.
So in some sense, by leaning into it, you found that it wasn't as scary, so to speak.
Well, it's like opens the Pandora's box. If I'm going to tell this story, like there's much more to this story than just that moment. Like we were talking about before, just before we started recording. This is not a discrete moment in time. This panic attack and my reaction to it is part of a much longer lead up where I'm gradually starting to come out as someone who's got mental illness and has struggled with anxiety and depression over time. But, that coming out would be, it might have be a one-on-one discussion with someone where they're struggling with something and say, look, I get it. I've been feeling this at other times in my life, often with a student in that kind of situation. Then I remember doing a thing on Facebook where for a couple of months I decided every day I'm going to chronologically go through and post a YouTube clip of a song that blew my mind the first time I listened to it, starting from when I was a kid and through my life. And so, of course, music is a window to the soul, right, and to how you're feeling at a given moment in time. It's so coded with the story of your life. And it was through that I gently disclosed, this period, this song helped me because I was feeling this.
Nice.
So it was a soft disclosure, if you like.
Sure. And how deep are those roots?
Well, this is part of, my treatment and seeking help. So I first realised something, that I needed to get help. Something wasn't quite right when I was a PhD student back in Adelaide. So we're talking about 2006, 2007. And at the time I thought, I'm a bit overweight and I can't really kick it. There's probably some emotional reason for that. So I'm going to go see the counsellor at the counselling service at the university. And that was the first time I'd actually gone and tried to get some kind of assisted therapy. And so they gave me some kind of cognitive behavioural therapy stuff, which I found didn't really work. I'm not one of Pavlov's dogs. And although there's some merit to CBT, there's too much that's contributing to how I'm feeling that just trying to say something different about my experience is not going to get it done. There's some deep stuff that needs to be explored and dealt with. But even like being able to articulate that need like I am now, that's not how I was feeling in that moment. Just like I'm not really resonating with cognitive behavioural therapy. And so I did that counselling for about 6 months and then just got on with the business of doing my PhD. Became a father as well. Don't recommend having a child at the same time as you're trying to do a doctorate. So think of multiple stresses coming into your life. As someone who has anxiety, that's a big burden. Then I got my first full-time gig with Trobe University, where I am now in 2010, and went back to counselling again there. And there's a great life irony about this. So I was based at the Albury-Wodonga campus of La Trobe University. Now, when I was 12, I went to Albury on a basketball camp and suffered a trauma there. So I went back to a place where I'd experienced a trauma as a child. And so that brought up some issues, which I started to address through counselling. So now I'm getting to some trauma history and starting to process that. And that was really hard, fronting up to that.
Did you know that? Were you cognizant of that by taking that role? You would also be stepping into that space?
It wasn't really a consideration. Like, obviously I knew, my history at the place, but, when you're in academia, it's a tough profession. You take your break where you can get it. So that was my break. I went there, but then the first time we drove past this place where it happened, it's, oh yeah. And then it, gradually became more of an issue.
And there's a real conflict there, isn't there, in terms of here's something that's awfully difficult and painful, a considerable challenge, and simultaneously this is an incredible opportunity and break for you in academia. Those roles don't come around very often, and there's a bit of tension in the rope, so to speak, about the thing that you want and the thing that you don't want.
After I'd had a few sessions, I was really starting to rip the Band-Aid off on these experiences. And there was this one night where I sunk into this place where I just couldn't talk. And I was really sucked within and feeling really heavy. And I just couldn't say anything. And that lasted most of the night. And then I was all right after that. But I think that was I remember my therapist at the time said, when you rip the Band-Aid off, when the wound is exposed to the air, it's going to hurt, but it'll only hurt for a little while, and and ultimately it will heal because you let it be exposed to the air, but you've got to go through that moment first. And that was that moment for dealing with that particular trauma.
It's a nice metaphor, isn't it, to kind of hold on to in trying to understand that for something to heal, we've got to expose it to the air, and the air is going to mean that it's going to be sensitive. It's going to kind of flare up, so to speak, or it's going to be more sensitive, at least for a period.
Yeah, so there was that. I haven't really written about that in my other writings. It's not, it's obviously a more complex story that I don't really want to get into publicly. But it's there. There was some other school bullying kind of stuff as well. So that came out then. So that was one phase. Then at work we had an organisational restructure where my position was abolished, but I got redeployed to the Melbourne campus where I've been for the last 7 years. So in itself, that opened up workplace anxiety triggers of all kinds. That's something I'm starting to explore further now. I can understand how my experience as someone with a mental illness interacts with environmental triggers. And I'm just starting to, figure that out and get a language for that now. But really, before then, it's all about what are all these different influences from my past that were shaping my anxiety experiences? What were the things that were making me feel this way? I got relentlessly obsessive about trying to figure this out. And every time I'd go through cycles where, I'd come to one revelation and I'd kind of deal with that. And then I'd, go back into everyday life, and something would happen in my life, and often at work, that would raise something that I had to deal with, and I'd go into the cycle again. So we had a second restructure at work, which is again, it's organisational restructures are intensely traumatic for everyone involved, because they just put everyone in such an insecure space, and in a space of powerlessness as well. So it was in the context of this that I remember it was the first lecture I did for a subject, and I was trying to explain to my students, like, just be kind on the staff, because we're going through this thing that's really difficult. And I outlined some of the pathological student behaviours that are going to have an impact on the teaching staff. And I went through them systematically and said, look, don't do that. That's going to have this impact. But do this. This is a positive way to deal with those concerns. And I had this student who never came to class, who messaged me and said, I'm sick of all you lecturers, you're all psychopaths. That was the shittest lecture I've ever had, so demotivating. I'm like, who are you? You don't like it? Unenroll. Don't need this. And emailed back and said, I've got all these mental health issues, like significant mental health traumas. That's why I don't come to class. And why don't you just quit? It's clear that you hate your job. And at that moment, I did hate my job, and he called me on it. He'd never met me. He just read it from this lecture experience. And it was like, wow, it made me self-reflect about where I was at in that moment. And so I've got to do something about this, because I'm really miserable at this point in time in this work environment. And I went and talked to a trusted senior colleague. And so this was the first time I'd disclosed this to someone at work. And they were really fantastic. They shared some of their own experiences and encouraged me to go get some help again. So I went to the doctor, to my GP, and said, look, I'm having this. What do you recommend? Prescribed some antidepressants and some counselling as well. So I went into another round of counselling with a psychologist here, and she was fantastic. So I was in that process for about 1.5 to 2 years, and delved even further. So it wasn't just the trauma episode. Then it was going into starting to trace a fear of abandonment that I'd been feeling, and what possible roots might be for that, and how both of this trauma and the abandonment fear would manifest in all the relationships I was having, and how I was interacting, particularly at work and with the relationships at home. Going a little bit deeper, and again, going into dark places that hadn't seen the light for a while.
And how do you feel that's been helpful for you in your, I suppose, onion metaphor of another layer? It seems like each time that you sought some assistance or spoke with someone trusted, you kind of examined, you peeled back a layer, you kind of looked at it from another perspective. How's that been helpful for you?
Well, it's like the reward for answering questions is more questions in some ways. But I think self-understanding is really good. I could get to a place of acceptance and being able to accept where I am. If I could understand why I was like that, I think that was really important for me. So in this round of counselling, like I was doing the ACT therapy, the Russ Harris happiness trap kind of thing. And that was reasonably useful. My therapist also encouraged me to start, expressing my feelings creatively. So I started drawing imagery of what I was feeling. Now, none of that stuff's going to go in the NGV as artistic genius, but that wasn't the point of the process. It gave me a way to express deep emotional feelings and get them out of my head and out of my body. And I realized there was so much of this past stuff that was coded and trapped into my body and how I was feeling, and it was stuck there, And so problems with difficulties with weight or physical illnesses and stuff like that. This was trapped emotional stuff. And by getting that out, that was a release. And so that was really important. But every time I've gone through one of these cycles of therapy and healing. Like I learn new strategies and new tips and tricks. And it's like my toolbox for maintaining my health is growing. And I've got little strategies that I can share with other people as well, which I think I've tried to do in my writing. So, I'm not a therapist myself, but here's something that I found helpful in my situation. Does that resonate?
In some sense, you are a therapist. You're examining your experience, how you interact with the world, how your history goes out and tries to push you around, how thoughts arise and the power that we give them or not. You're very much, by your inquisitive nature, in many aspects, examining to see another perspective, which is what a lot of therapy does, at least that as a starting point to then uncover other areas to examine with that greater appreciation. I think you, as you discussed it in terms of coming to accept or to adopt, to make room for you as you are, with maybe lesser judgment.
Well, there's more to this story. So, starting to examine relationships within my family, parental relationships, spousal relationships, and then with my son, and what's shaping that. Then I started to do some work on inherited trauma and family history issues, and I realised actually there's a lot in my family background that's probably having an ongoing impact on the matrix of family relationships that I'm part of. So on my mother's side, my maternal grandparents were both from Ukraine, and they were both taken to Nazi Germany and were in forced labour camps during the Second World War. So that they had an extreme experience. I think my grandfather died when I was reasonably young, so I don't know much about his story. But my grandmother, particularly later in her life, when I'd go over there by myself to have dinner with her, and she'd tell the same old stories, but every time there was just a little added detail to the story. So she constructed this really wonderful mosaic of her experience from that time. So she was a peasant farm girl from near Lviv in Western Ukraine. Like when she was born, that was part of Poland. And she experienced the Soviet Union coming in and taking over that area in the late 30s. Unfortunately for her, that was after the Great Famine had occurred in Ukraine, so she didn't cop the full brunt of that. But she still experienced the Soviets coming and taking over their farm and taking all the food and the stock and putting them into essentially bonded feudal servitude in that system. And then the Germans came, and she, like many Eastern Europeans at that time, she was taken into bonded labour in Germany, and she had to work during the war in a munitions factory. I think it was somewhere near Cologne. And even to the day she died, she had arthritis in her knee because she was using a pedal-powered lathe machine that she'd worked on there. And just some of the stories that she used to tell us about, when there was an Allied bombing run and they used to send them out into the streets to clean up the bodies. And what she was telling me was really sanitized. So her life experience was much, much more extreme there than anything she would have told me. But even like before all that happened, her mother died when she was a baby, and she had this really difficult relationship with her stepmother who didn't love her at all. So just in my grandmother's history, there's all of these traumas that are adding up. And you can see later in her life how, she wasn't the warmest woman. And, looking back, I can see how that shaped her relationship with my mum and my uncle. And then you can see, like, all of the migrants of that generation had the same experience. You could see similar patterns across their families. And it's just this web of trauma. Then I looked on my paternal side, And so obviously my surname's Habib, that's Lebanese. My great-grandfather emigrated in the 1890s to South Australia. And, you know, obviously that's a time White Australia policy is coming in. And the Lebanese migrants of that time tried so hard to prove that they were European so they wouldn't get kicked out under the White Australia policy, but experiencing the full brunt of good old Aussie racism. And there's plenty of stuff in that family history that isn't talked about, but is clearly there. And the culture of that family was completely stripped because they were trying to prove that they were European and not Lebanese. And so it got completely anglicised. So not only is there a trauma history there, but there's a disconnection from culture and history. So on both sides of my family, I've got this deep heritage that I know very little about and have no cultural anchor as well, in which I could locate myself. So there was a whole lot of stuff going on within my family history that I feel like has contributed to my experience of anxiety, and probably a lot more that I'll never know about as well.
There's some excellent work by, I think, a lady named Eva Jablonka who writes in the space of epigenetics and how trauma is in some, or in many respects, passed on to the next generation through our, I suppose, our DNA footprint, and how there are particular parts of DNA that are methylated or not, depending on our environment, and everything from trauma through to even things like our exposure to BPA, and hence why pregnant women are encouraged to take folates and the other supplements to try and in essence moderate some of these things that we know clearly, but there's a lot that's not known clearly that is passed on from one heritage to the next, or one generation to the next, that I think is a growing body of evidence to look at that. So when you say there is kind of sort of a historic experience within your lineage, so to speak, I think it says something. We're not quite sure what, but I think we can make some assumptions.
Well, the politics analyst in me is really intrigued by this. And you think, well, a country that was established as a totalitarian prison camp, which the original settlement of White Australia was, extreme brutality of the convict system, then couple that with the genocide of Indigenous peoples, and obviously that trauma was not processed. Where has it gone? And so, I'm interested to hear what you think about some of the more, toxic cultural elements of Australian society. Do they have some kind of root in this trauma history?
Gosh, I think it's a very complex sort of space. I think we certainly know that there are all aspects of nature and nurture. The issue that will come about is the measurement of any of these things, and our challenge, even with something like anxiety, is how do we differentiate nature versus nurture, and that interplay, and even measuring what are the contributors for that. So, I might feel, for example, somewhat introverted in my experience, and so having to do something that might be a little bit more public or in the open public space may potentially go out and bring that about. But not just because I'm introverted, because there's introverted people who are still happy to go out and do that and don't feel that fear. So introversion isn't a fear center. So it doesn't mean that everyone that's introverted has fear of judgment. There's plenty who are extroverted and have a fear of judgment. So there's a real complexity around around that, and hence why I think some of the work of Eva Jablonka and her colleagues, who I do a clumsy version of explaining what how those the different facets have an interplay with one another, but there's huge kind of connections between our environment and how we are, and hence that's exactly kind of what we do in therapy. We kind of look at quite often, what was your upbringing like, because that's kind of where we learnt all of our norms, all of our beliefs, and this is where we get our stereotypes, and this is where in essence so much racism and sexism and ageism and whatever other ism comes from a series of ideas. None of these things are true or valid or grounded in any real validity. They're just ideas, and we adopt them blindly. And in essence, anxiety is also somewhat an adoption of ideas. And when we can question those, at least it helps to kind of loosen the grip that they have on us.
Mm-hmm. Well, the practical application of this environment versus self interplay comes in when we think of workplace. And like me, as someone who has anxiety, how do I interact with the organisational systems in which I'm immersed in the workplace, or in any other institutional setting that I interact with?
My apologies. On the outside, people would look at you and say, here's, Dr. Ben Habib, clearly, an amazing professional, very successful, ticking all the boxes, working in a university in Melbourne. He's got the dream. Like he's a high achiever. The rest of us are trying to catch up. The surface stuff is kind of a distraction from the reality, which is, the thing that you and I have in common is that we're both of a human origin, and so the human feels the same thing. Experience the same thing. We, illness does not discriminate. And so if something's going to get us, it's because we're human. It'll get both of us. It doesn't care what our status, role, age, whatever it might be, is. It's going to get us. And despite wearing a suit or shorts, or is my t-shirt ripped, or am I wearing my best shirt and bow tie?
Yeah, and that's a great point on our shared humanity. And yet we have all these institutions that we're a part of that are these hierarchical systems of coercive power relationships that dehumanize in a lot of ways, and often in ways that we don't notice because we think they're normal, but actually they're doing us great harm. So one of the pernicious ways that these power relationships manifest, when look at workplace mental health strategies, they're all about individualizing responsibility for mental health onto the individual person. And that really bothers me because there's a complex mix. Like, there's lots of stuff that I'm responsible for and I need to take responsibility for. And I think of my own experience. I've had the counselling. I've done the hard yards and the hard work. I've shed the tears. I've talked about it. I take care of myself. And yet, in these specific institutional environments, I'm still having these really adverse reactions. Is there actually something toxic about these larger environments that's contributing to how I'm feeling? Because I'm having very specific negative reactions in a lot of these places. So I'm trying to flesh that out.
I mean, it's a really good question, because when I think about the way that we live our lives, and the way that we experience life, the fact that we even have these ideas called deadlines can feel toxic. Depending on how we define what toxic is. The fact that something's stressful, that it goes out and increases our angst, that we worry about, that keeps us up at night. It's an arbitrary time frame, and in some sense, how else do we operate? And so it's kind of this strange tension between the two, where I imagine there's lots of things that we could call, air quotes, toxic or, stressful or provoke angst, discomfort, pain that is inherent in living, in basically the way that society's built. That society these days, is not easy, and we need to kind of learn to carry it, or to try and see it in a different way, because it's kind of hard to find any organisation that doesn't adhere to these kind of general rules, which in the big picture are all completely made up. Just any rule will do, whether it's constitution or not. We just make up a rule. If someone's being late, they're being disrespectful. Well, that's a rule. No different to if you stop at a red light, you're a good driver. We just make these rules up, and some obviously are much more helpful than others. If you hold, the idea of someone has to be on time to be respectful, if you hold that tightly, you're in trouble, because people are going to be late all the time in your life, and you're going to feel disrespected all the time. Probably quite useful to hold the one that you should stop at a red light. Will probably save your life a few times.
Yeah. And these are great observations, because now we get to the international relations aspect of what I do. And I look at some of the chaos that's in the world now and see, well, actually, these systems and these norms and rules that we've developed, they don't seem to be very adaptive for 21st century problems. Our political systems are really dysfunctional. You don't get Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or people like that in political systems that are stable and are functioning well. Those kinds of personalities are a product of chaos. I look at the climate change issue and eco-anxiety. I've had that since the mid-2000s when I started learning about climate change. I thought, I could see the end game of this, and this is really serious. And yet, so you're dealing with this really serious big picture issue, and the dissonance between that and lack of action in your ordinary life or from the institutions that are part of it, just ignoring that. And young people get this. You can see from the global climate strikes and the angst that that youth have got. They fully understand this, and they're not comfortable with the cognitive dissonance of this space of inaction. So I guess I think we've really mapped out this journey of me thinking about all of these influences on my anxiety and my mental health, from me right up to this global meta stuff. And I've been trying to think about, well, how does this mix in together? And what can I do about all of these things? Because obviously a big picture issue like climate change requires a radically different strategy of action to me processing trauma, or me figuring out how to function properly in my workplace. Again, requires a different set of strategies and coping mechanisms to those other things. So, figuring out what to do, where to put my energy, and where I'm going to get the greatest leverage to heal myself and be healthy. That's my next challenge.
What are you leaning towards? What are your clues at the moment? What are your thoughts? Where do you think you'll go with that?
Well, that's where the individualization problem. I think the bigger in scale the problem is, the more you need to collaborate with other people. If there's stuff that I can do and explore on my own, I'm doing that. But I might need help from a counsellor to explore deeper stuff. If I want to have a healthy workplace, then I'm going to have to collaborate with other people. I'm going to have these kinds of conversations. I'm going to have to engage with people who have power in these institutions and try and come up with, a set of arrangements that are healthy for everyone. And then some of these bigger cultural issues, that you're getting into the realm of social movements and other public advocacy stuff there. So I think I'm looking at my mental health from this really big picture perspective, where my entire existence is shaping how I'm feeling, and how I interact with everything in my society is shaped by my mental health experience. In some ways, it's really exciting because you can start to understand your connection with everything around you when you look at it that way. So it's not isolating. But on the other hand, it's really damn daunting because the process of healing is just so all encompassing. Like it has to become your life. So yeah, I can't say I've made enormous strides in how to deal with that, but that's kind of like my healing project as it stands at the minute.
In some sense, then, I apologise if I've read this wrong, but it sounds like you're exploring a position going from healing on an individual level to healing as a collective in by virtue of connecting with others. That connectedness can be part of the healing space for you in terms of feeling more connected and bonded and secure as a group, as a community, as a people, rather than just your focus being on the micro. Going more sort of macro for you feels like it's the next space.
Yeah, definitely. I think some of my anxiety symptoms are a product of feeling isolated and feeling alone and not feeling I have support. But that's not how humans exist. Like the fact that we have a society is a product of all these webs of interconnections, and yet we've got these ideas of individualism that are not consistent with the reality of connection that we have. So I know I feel in a better space. My resilience is much increased when I'm connected with other people. I'm in good relationships with other people and feeling love and be able to give love. But also being able to heal some of the toxicity that I produce as a result of my past trauma experiences. So it's not just what's been done to me. I've done some bad things too. And I need to own them and understand why, I put myself in that space so I can be that loving and productive member of community that I want everyone else to be. So it's the micro and the macro together.
There's some amazing work that comes from research like Johann Hari, if you're familiar with him, who I think has got an excellent TED talk around the idea of using, heroin once. If you try it once, you'll be addicted forever, so don't ever go out and try it. And he looked at some of the factors that contribute to that. And so the famous experiment goes something like this, so please don't quote me, but put a rat in a box by itself and give it the option between water and heroin water. And obviously it needs to have a little bit of sweetness, because otherwise it's quite bitter and disgusting. So, but the rat goes out and tastes from each, and because it's inquisitive, and then almost solely goes and consumes from the heroin water, and so the idea came from that experiment that you try it once, you're hooked, and you'll never get off. And so that was widely adopted, and another experiment came in, and if you're interested, have a look at some YouTube videos on Rat Park. So a new experimenter looked at the different variables and basically developed a park where a whole lot of rats lived. And so, in that space of Rat Park, they had, the animals had, capacity to go out and have a hierarchy. They had sex, socialization, mazes, activities to do, chasing one another, places to hide, and so on. So it was quite a rich, inclusive, vibrant space. And without sort of boring you too much with all the different aspects, experimenters would go out and give an animal that was addicted to heroin, in a box by itself, and they would put it back into Rat Park with the opportunity to have heroin. And they found that the animal in Rat Park would stop taking the heroin water. So the heroin water was something that was very appealing when they were alone, when they were isolated, when they had no one around them. But once they were integrated back into bonding, that space of bonding, it was not appealing anymore. And so the experimenters did all sorts of interesting different variations of this, where they made the whole community take the heroin water only by denying the water. And so they made them addicted, and then they gave them days where they had choice days. And they found that the rats, even in choice days, would go out and choose the water despite having what we would call symptoms of withdrawal, because they were in that space. And it's fascinating that this moderating factor of isolation or bonding plays such a huge role. And I know that pharmaceutical companies have done some similar things in testing different medications. The way to make an animal depressed or anxious or despair, or depending on what you're trying to do, you can chuck them in a room by themselves with zero stimulation, and it makes animals go mad. And hence why things like solitary confinement are against the Geneva Convention, because it's called torture. It's horrific stuff. So you and I can be in a big city, with thousands of people around, and yet if we feel disconnected, by virtue of that, we're going to start feeling that, and we're certainly going to feel that in feelings like depression, anxiety, emotional fluctuations, and the like. So I think, not having spoken for too long, but I think you're on the money. Part of our healing process, whether it be yourself, I, or anyone else, is to bond with others, to be connected, and not just say, oh, I'm part of a book club. I need to have friends in that book club. I need to care for those people in the book club. I need to know when someone's going into hospital because they're unwell. I need to be connected. Like, it's got to be a close bond, not, I'm a football fan and so I go and watch, the Canberra Raiders play. That's not quite going to cut it.
Being part of a crowd of 100,000 at the MCG doesn't mean you're connected to any of them, does it? But, this stuff's not a secret, is it? The connection is good for our well-being. So the question is, why?
Unfortunately, in some sense, it feels like it is. That it's. I don't think the power of it, how potent bonding, connectedness is understood. I think it's like stupidly potent. We just go, it would be good if you went out and socialised more. No. This isn't about socialisation. This is about going out and bonding. There's a potency that comes with that.
Yeah. It's interesting that, like, this kind of social cohesion is built into traditional cultures in a way that it's not in ours. And so, like, if you ask the question, what do you do about this? Well, that's not a project of personal resilience. That's a political project about what you do about that. So it leads to some radical places about what do you do in order to create conditions, communities that are healthy for people.
And likewise, in the meantime, maybe on an individual level, we can also, in connection with that, work really hard at bonding with our fellow humans, where we actively seek that out. I know Australia, we're wildly, individualistic. And I know when I go back to, Serbia, where my heritage is from, and I can't tell you the historical sort of nature and the like, but I tell you what, it's a whole lot more of a community collective sort of approach where I'll sit at my uncle's house and no word of a lie, 4 people will drop in each day. And they'll drop in or they'll yell out from the veranda, "Hey, how you going? Come over. While we're just putting something together, come in and have lunch with us." There's, we tend to kind of organise things in advance and we'll schedule it in rather than drop in. That nature of my house is your house. We're kind of like, no, my house isn't your house. My house is my house, and I'm going to put, I'm going to spend thousands of dollars putting a fancy fence around it so no one can see into us and look over the fence, heaven forbid.
Boundaries and fences, hey?
So does this sort of aspect kind of feed into a lot of the work that you look at in terms of your international relations, work that obviously, you're an expert in?
Yeah, it does. It does. So I did my PhD work on North Korea. And, we know it's a dictatorship. It's got this cult of personality around the leaders. And the whole system is intentionally built to eliminate the possibility of people developing bonds between people. Because when people bond together, that leads to collective action, which leads to a threat to the system of power. So the whole idea is that you create a system where people are competing against each other, where they can get ahead by ratting each other out, where they can get in trouble for collusion or any kind of collective action. And it's rounded out by an ideology that encourages you to focus solely on the leader as your path to salvation. And you just think, wow, some of that stuff, I can see echoes of that in our society here. And the effects on people are so pernicious and so damaging, of eliminating their capacity to bond with each other and to establish connection. It leaves damage. So I think about, for looking at trauma, like even if that North Korean regime falls tomorrow, the legacy of that trauma is going to last for a long, long time.
It's incredible how much this concept of collective, togetherness, bonding, connection plays in, whether it be an international arena or our own individual psychological experience. That in some sense the dictator for each of us is the mind, telling us, don't do this or don't connect. You could get rejected. I'm being abandoned. They don't like me. What happens if I'm judged? After my panic attack, it's an embarrassment. It's a failure, and I'm never going to be able to recover. Not suggesting that's what the thoughts were, but we've all in some sense felt these things, and so the best thing to do, at least in that moment, it feels like it's to escape, to retreat, to isolate, and that thing that we've come full circle. The thing that kind of attracted me to reaching out to you is that you didn't do that. You said, bullshit, I'm going out and I'm going to put it out there and I'm going to talk about it, rather than hiding and being scared. I know that it wasn't a fairy tale exactly like that, but you did in that moment of anguish and pain stick your neck out and say, I'm going to kind of connect with others. I'm going to put it out there. I'm going to face my fears, so to speak.
That's right. The road back for me in that moment was when people connected with me. And I realised that I wasn't alone, and that there were lots of people. It was incredible that hundreds of emails from people around the world, essentially sharing the same thing. Some of them were disclosing this stuff for the first time to anyone. So that was it was really touching, but also it was a big burden.
It's kind of crazy. One of my biggest passions in psychology is to take away these from what I believe are stupid categories. You know, they're just unhelpful categories most of the time. You know, to go out and say this person has got this disorder and they've got that disorder and so on, rather than describing the experience. You know, once we go out and describe the actual experience, we recognize that most of us have felt or feel these things quite regularly. And the problem is that when we use a category, we say, oh, no, that's not me. I don't have that. And the other problem of the category is saying, if you do have it, there's something wrong with you. Rather than saying, oh, so you've got the category of human. Oh, I've got that one too. Yeah, you and I are both made out of, you know, flesh and bones, and you know, I kind of get what it feels like to be in, you know, my skin, and sounds like you've got some similar things in your skin, and looking around when we're bonded with others. There's a lot of things that we go out and see are the same, and you know, whether it be becoming a parent, we realize no matter what your role is, no matter what your job is, no matter what you do in life, you've still got to go out and wipe your baby's bottom, you know, at 3 a.m. in the morning. You know, it's the leveler, you know, and it's a beautiful thing, and it's hard going. You know, there's lots of things that level us, and I think being human is a nice leveler. And so one of my passions is to try and remove this ongoing conversation of diagnostics. You know, that we can just remove the word disorder. You know, we can go to some experiencing obsessions and compulsions. I don't have to call it a disorder, because most conscientious people are absolutely, you know, orderly and, you know, have compulsions to keep things orderly. And they think about those things quite often, and you know, they're stressed if they don't keep things in order. Just that one might be a little bit more functional than the other, but even that's questionable at times, because I tell you what, conscientiousness can also cause relationship difficulties. But we don't call that a disorder. We just go and say, oh, you're highly conscientious and you have relationship difficulties.
No, it's really interesting. I got asked in an interview recently, you know, would I call my anxiety a medical condition? And I felt really uncomfortable with that. So that's when you start pathologizing this stuff. One, that's individualizing it.
Yes.
Two, that's okay, let's treat that with pharmaceuticals and just medicate you like you're a machine. And then three, it reinforces the idea that there's something inherently wrong with you.
Yeah.
Now, I understand there is a place from time to time people that legitimately need medication.
Absolutely.
To treat stuff, but there's no healing that comes from medication. You know, it's just a palliative, and I've always had discomfort from that. I've had 2 periods where I was on antidepressants for a period of time, and I weaned off both times. It helped me in a moment as a coping mechanism, but it was never going to get me to a better place. I had to do the work, and ultimately I felt better for getting off them and doing the self-exploration.
I think acceptance and commitment therapy has a lot to say about, you know, how we might use, you know, medication. And recently in a podcast with Kirk Strozel, he discussed, you know, talking about how we might go and integrate medication within therapy, and he's working with a book with Rob Percy up in Brisbane, who's a psychiatrist, you know, which really looks at functionality rather than symptom reduction. You know, can I use something to help me, you know, function better? No different to, hey, my leg is sore, I'm going to use a walking stick to help me go out and walk. But also with the understanding that if my walking stick isn't there, maybe I can still walk. You know, I've got to kind of make room for a sore leg, because it's going to be there at times. Not suggesting that there aren't other times that you might need not only a walking stick, but maybe someone to get, you know, under your arm and prop you up, you know, because there's different fluctuations. But I think there's a nice sort of position to kind of hold. You know, another good place that I would maybe recommend for our listeners to explore is some of the work from Joanna Moncrief, who is a practicing psychiatrist who I think has a lot to say about that space of functionality and how medication might be prescribed. She's fairly outspoken. She's written some books, but she's done so having looked at significant meta-analyses on huge bodies of work and literature from all around the world, and I think it's a really good read. So some good places to look at, because it's not that medication's evil or bad. We've just got to look at what's it intended to do, and if the intention is wrong, I think we've gone out and potentially causing more grief.
It's a tool, it's not an end.
Ben, I've got to say thank you so much for your openness, being candid about your experience and talking about it. I know it's been quite a journey and continues to be human, to kind of buck the trend, so to speak, and come out, which is funny term in and of itself. I'm going to come out and I'm human. I go through challenges. But I really appreciate this conversation that you have started, and I'm sorry it came from that sort of place, but in some sense I'm glad it did, because that's started from what I can see a much bigger conversation as well. How can people find out more about what you do at the moment, your blogs, how you go out and share these things? Where can they find out more about you?
Yeah, my blog's at drbenjaminhabib.com. That's a clearinghouse of all my professional activities. So there's some international relations stuff, there's some permaculture and environmental stuff. But for the mental health stuff, there's a tab at the top on mental health and anxiety that's got a listing of all the writings I've done and media appearances as well. So the link to this podcast will end up on that page as well.
I've read quite a few of them, and I love your writing style. It's really good. It's really good. It's you could have a journalist background if you ever wanted to give up the IR.
Yeah, thanks, Nesh. And my style, look, I'm not professing to be an expert. I'm just talking about my experience. It's not my job to tell people what to do. This is just my experience, and it happens to resonate with lots of people. So that's where I'm coming from there.
Thank you so much, Ben. It's been wonderful having you, and I know listeners are going to get a whole lot of value out of that. And make sure you go to, what was the website again?
drbenjaminhabib.com.
drbenjaminhabib.com. Cheers, Ben. Thanks heaps.
Thanks, Nesh.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.